A robbery. The spaceship's engineer lay unconscious at my feet, a state I had put him in. We were in the engine room of the mighty Welkin, at the rear of the space-traveling craft. Before us were the source rods, spares in case the ship required more fuel. They might have been orange glow sticks held by a child, but instead they were one of the most expensive elements in the known universe, a power source running this ship all the way from Earth to Cerulean. The price that one rod could be illegally sold for would easily start a new life. Perfect for a broke, single young girl. Well, technically a broke engaged girl, but I'd only fooled Dante into believing he had my heart so I could escape my horrible life. I'd leave that gangster behind on Cerulean. I took a tense breath, then exhaled onto the foggy laserproof glass that protected the rods, preparing for my heist, steal the source rod. A simple procedure of cutting through the glass, grabbing the source rod and scramming unseen. An important factor given the penalty for my crime would be death. At least the sleeping engineer wouldn't be telling any stories. The tiny nerve neutralizer disc I had shot him with remained stuck upon his neck and glowing red. The boyish man was dressed in a white button shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his biceps, trying to show off his pathetic twig arms. It appeared he was attempting to grow a beard, but had only managed a grassy, darkish blonde stubble. His brown slacks were light years out of fashion, and one of his bootlaces was left undone. Talk about untidy. "Stop stalling, Evita," I whispered. With great nerves twisting my stomach in more directions than the numerous pipes running along the walls, I used my heat cutter to begin slicing a hole through the glass, creating an opening big enough to reach through. Too scared to use my fiancé money card lest he discover the purchase, I'd been forced to use the small allowance on my card to purchase a cheap cutter, a supermodel from Mexico, but it failed to live up to its super name. It flicked and sparked as the red-hot beam lacerated the glass. My hat-sized circle was mere inches from being complete when bang, the worthless cutter sparked a crimson bloom that more resembled a laser gun. The instrument heated to furnace temperatures, and I dropped it. It landed on my boots and skidded onto the ground, fizzied as it short-circuited. A puff of smoke signified the cutter's days were zilch. Like my days could be. Damn it. My mother, who disappeared when I was 7, always told me you have a sweet singer's voice, darling, but my cuss came out more like a miserable boss's scolding. I stomped back, and accidentally kicked the engineer in the head. A grunt escaped his lips, and after tiny nose twitches resembling a mouse sniffing cheese, he opened his eyes. How could he wake? I possibly have to kill the callow man, I thought. Could I even do that? Well, it will be him or me. The engineer's hazel eyes caught me for a moment, hazel and hazy as a Saudi sandstorm. He didn't appear to register me or even his own whereabouts, and quickly slipped back into dreamland, blonde hair slipping over his eyes. Okay, this is going bad, I told myself. But I haven't survived for years with the mob only to quit my mission, because a cheap dealer sold me a crummy cutter in Calexico. I needed another plan. Across the room lay a sturdy cross wrench, the old kind used to undo sockets in case your core drill went flat or on some rare occasions exploded. I hopscotched over the sleeping man and retrieved the wrench. The way to the rods lay before me, a small reach through the glass and then drill one from its socket. I tapped my already cut area of glass to check it for strength. It still felt sturdy, robust. It would take a good wrench whacking to bust it open, and the racket could arouse suspicion from the corridor. I glanced back at the closed door. I hope you're soundproof, I whispered. Then I rammed the wrench into the glass. The boom echoed around the engine room, but the glass did not break. The door then took my attention, the handle in particular. It didn't even twitch. I returned to beating the glass, a boom of shattering ricochets, and after some muscle tensioning pounds, the glass circle snapped with a loud crack, and the round piece popped through the room and tinged onto the floor as a near-perfect circle. I took my core drill from my hip pouch, then snuck it through the hole in the glass. The rods were attached to the wall with tiny silver screws, and I stuck my drill in a screw head as tight as possible, knowing if I couldn't get the screws out, the heist was over, and I'd be destined to live out my days in misery as the wife of Dante. In desperation, I held my breath and pulled the trigger on the drill. The drill bit bumped and ground and spun over the screw head, and fortunately it unwound the screw. The silver piece plopped out and fell onto the ground with a mousy ting. While my free hand rested against the glass, I drilled out 3 screws. The rod now dangled precariously on an angle. If it fell, it could explode and not only kill me, but it could ignite the rest of the rods and blow a hole in the back of the ship. Steady, girl, I told myself, wiping a drop of sweat from my brow. All I had to do was detach the final screw, then drop my drill and catch the rod before it struck the floor. Easy, if you have the reflexes of a mongoose. For extra reach, I pushed my body against the glass and then started unscrewing the final piece. The drill rumbled in my hands, slowly, gently, deliberately. I readied to catch the rod. My breathing intensified. The screw almost out. Then a person's murky shadow reflected in the glass. "Don't be stupid," they said from over my shoulder. A young man's voice, kind of innocent and sweet, but also dumb. Another glance into the glass confirmed it was the engineer. How did he wake? And shouldn't he be stressed over a thief stealing such a priceless commodity? Why such confidence? Maybe he has a weapon pointed at me. Hell, does he have a laser gun? In all the thrill of the robbery, I had forgotten to check. My body was still constrained against the glass, one hand bracing myself, the other stretched in holding the drill to the screw that sat perilously in the hole. I couldn't move. I could not turn around and sock his chin. The only defense against him, bluffing. "If you shoot me," I told him in my rough gangster tone, "I'll drop the rod and we'll both die." "Ooh," he said, twisting his face in fake pain. "That's cold." My face heralded no expression. "No. It will be a hot death." The young man shuffled in beside me, the disc on his neck flickering precariously from red to green before dropping to the floor. That's why he woke. Stupid cheap neutralizer gun. Damn cheap dealer. The engineer looked down at the disc, then peered at me. "Seems you failed in frying my nerves, lady." I simply glared back. A glare intended to scare him. Maybe it would work. His body was barely thicker than the cross-wrench. But he didn't run cowering from my scowling. Instead, his boyish face clutched an arrogant grin, his eyes a little shrouded by scraggly hair. He looked flamboyantly old-fashioned, like some hippie surfer from many centuries past. He focused his hazel eyes upon the drill in my hand. "Screw the rod back in," he said. After being bullied by Dante, there was no chance of taking orders from a hippie engineer. I twiddled my fingers on my free hand. My fingers are destined to save me and myself. By stealing. "I'm taking a rod," I told him. "Then if you let me leave, I'll let you live." I had no clue if that was a genuine warning or an empty threat. But even if he did allow me to depart, he could easily tell the patrols on board and help them find my face on the computer. It was settled. 2 of us were in the engine room, but only one was walking out. Could I really kill the young man? He couldn't have been more than 23, perhaps a year older than me. And not to mention he was sort of cute in a stupid, injudicious way, like a grown dog that hasn't figured out it's no longer a puppy. "How'd you get into the engine room anyway?" he said. As if I'd tell you, I thought. Now what to use for a weapon? I had no laser gun, and the broken cutter at my feet had shot its last beam of heat. The only viable option was to whip the drill from the screw, hope the screw doesn't fall and release the rod, then jam the drill into the man's temple, driving the bit into his brain. The thought of it, all the blood, the gooey flesh, the brain matter, made me wince, my face screwing into untold angles. The engineer noticed my crinkled nose. "Do I smell bad?" he questioned. "No," I said, and he actually smelled clean. "Just thinking of something messy." He tapped the glass with his finger. "Well, get to thinking of screwing that rod back in. This ship could lose power and float off course without it." "It's not going to float. The ship will fly fine," I told him. "It's merely a backup rod." "You sure?" he said, eyes slowly turning from the glass to dropping me a sly peep. But why was he questioning me? Shouldn't one of the ship's engineers be educated? "An engineer should know these are support rods," I said. He fully faced me and folded his arms, cocked one foot over the other, untied shoelace as out of place as his hair, then lazily leaned his shoulder against the glass like he was resting against a tree while watching swans glide upon a lake. "I'm the cleaner," he stated without any hint of humiliation over his demeaning job. "So you couldn't even fix one of the maintenance pods, let alone the ship?" His eyes narrowed, perplexed, then he scratched a hand through his early beginnings of a beard. "What's a maintenance pod?" I shook my head in frustration and also pity, but also relief. A stupid cleaner would be too dumb to stop me, maybe, perhaps. He could still report me, though. I sighed in desperation for an answer, a solution to my predicament, and dropped my gaze to my feet. And there lay my remedy, as if delivered by mail. The heavy wrench. Perfect for whacking him over the head, not a lethal blow, merely a blunt thud. He wouldn't die, he'd only fall unconscious and wake with a headache, and likely wouldn't remember me. His unintelligent grin made him appear he wouldn't recall much at the best of times. And even if he did recollect my face and got the patrols onto me, I'd just say he's a cleaner and a fool, and delusional from the knock to his skull, that he obtained by falling over, and being the promised wife to one of the richest men aboard this ship, a known mobster at that. They would see I had no need to steal the rod for extra money, and would believe my story over his. Dante might even have him thrown into the ship's lockup for telling such a tale. I threw a haughty glance. "Look here, boy." "Tanton," he said. "You're a cleaner," I said, "so clean up my broken glass." I smiled coyly and returned to the rod, and prepared to pull the trigger on the drill. Then an intruding hand slipped inside my pants pocket. Tanton swiftly plucked out my identity shield. He angled the reflective card back and forth, investigating my picture. A half-Mexican girl on a mad hair day. Yes, mad hair day. The picture was taken the day after my fake engagement. Dante made me update my card, so it appeared I had a rich, opulent upbringing. I wanted to snatch the card from Tanton's hand, then to sock him across the chin. But my body remained all tangled up, prepared to steal the rod, rendering me helpless. "Evita Sanchez," he said, and then offered a sly grin. "Every Mexican is a Sanchez." How racist. "My card goes back in my pocket or I drop the rod," I said, offering my mob-threatening stare, and his cheeky grin slowly drooped from his face because he knew I might be loco enough to do it. Then he put on a fake stare, the kind a cowboy wore before a duel. "The rod won't explode from that short fall." "Possibly not." "Want to test that theory?" I said, and his dueling stare blew away like a tumbleweed. Then I nodded to my hip and said, "My card." "My pocket." As he was about to return my card, he stopped, and a cockiness confidence took hold of him again, and he shook his head in little annoying jerks. "Second thoughts," he said, then slipped my card in his own pants pocket. "I'll keep a hold of this." "Screw him." "If it'll keep you warm at night," I said, then regained focus on the drill and squeezed the trigger. Zine. The screw dropped. The rod dropped. As the rod plunged toward the floor, threatening a death-dealing explosion, Tanton's eyes amplified in horror, but I dropped the drill and reached forward and snatched the free-falling rod. The rod was slightly warm and felt so good to hold in my hand. Not good because it didn't explode and blow me into little bloody pieces, but because it felt like my very first taste of freedom. Soon I was to leave Dante, change my identity so his goons couldn't hunt and kill me, and start a new life. A life just for me, where I could have everything, with no one giving me hassle. Carefully, I extracted the rod out through the hole in the glass, Tanton's eyes staring at me staring back, then smiling as I placed the rod in my hip pouch. The blameless look in his eye made it obvious that he would report me, so I dressed my face in seduction so he wouldn't expect the cross-wrench to the back of the skull. I smiled sexily. So sexily. I traced a finger across his cheeks, sliding the tip of my rose-painted nail toward his lips while he stared perplexed. The wrench waited at my feet. I slowly started to reach down for the weapon. Rather than a tightening of tension before the blow, an opposite sensation took me, a relaxing of all my bones and muscles, and a heightening of awareness. I could do this. Would do this. It was required for freedom. Freedom deserved after many horrid years. But Tanton wasn't a supporter of my newfound liberty. Tanton's eyes pierced into mine, and he said, "You're not going to try anything with that wrench?" Before I could answer, a noise rattled from the end corridor, sounding like a tall building tumbling to the ground, a vile succession of thuds that sent sirens through my head and shook my bones down to their quivering marrow. The iron door at the end of the corridor blew open, and a cloud of smoke, accompanied by a blistering hot fireball, roared through. Pieces of shrapnel flung across the hall, spanking into the walls opposite. If we had been standing in its line of fire, our bodies would have been peppered with bloody holes. Despite the heat, Tanton and I stood motionless as if an ice wind escaped through the locks and froze us. The flame continued unceasingly like a bushfire raging. Perhaps we were both waiting for the flames to die down and the wafts of stinking smoke to clear, and then we'd move our backsides. But the flame roared on. Fear kept my boots planted to the floor. Then I heard Tanton say, "Lady, we gotta scram before that flame eats us." His voice snapped me from my trance, and I looked around to the image of his hazel eyes glowing in the firelight. At the rear doorway, a ball of flame funneled toward us as if a dragon desired us roasted. We turned and ran toward the exit, scooting across the room while heat from the flame tore at the back of our necks, preparing to blister exposed skin. I tried calling out to myself faster, run faster, but couldn't manage any words. But it didn't matter, my body seemed to recognize my orders. My legs and arms pumped like pistons, and I pulled away from the cleaner who was stumbling over his undone shoelace. I could hear his breath distancing. He might not make it, but my chances of escape increased, as before me was the end of the corridor and the solid exit door. I swung it open and dashed through, and instantly my mind worked, as it always had, to preserve my life, and I spun around and grabbed the brass door handle, ready to pull the door shut. The cleaner ran hard toward me with flame billowing behind, and it would have been polite to wait, but the world is a gangster and waiting was an unnecessary risk. I yanked on the door to slam it, but somehow the cleaner made a mad dash and dove through the gap between door and arc. I slammed the door behind his trailing boots to a thud that mimicked the earlier explosion. Tanton stood on one side of the door while I laddered against the other, breathing as heavily as a lady who just gave birth to twins. Strands of my hair rested on the sides of my cheeks. It didn't feel soft. It felt singed. The heat was so intense it charred my hair. It scared me, for it indicated how close the fire had been to taking my life. Tanton's chest rose and fell in erratic rhythm, the panic in his eyes doubling the effect of horror. But it was all right, it was. I now stood on the other side of the door. Surely the oxygen in the engine room would be quickly eaten by the hungry flames, then the fire would die. I will not die, I told myself, I will live. Glad you waited to close the door after me, Tanton said, bending down to finally tie his lace. If only he knew. Yeah. Tanton straightened up, lace tied. What was that? Dumb cleaner. A fire. His eyes calmed from the fear they possessed and merged into a distilled seeking, a questioning. What was the noise, he said. Before the explosion of fire. What struck the ship? How should I know, I said, tone turning from fear to aggravation. You're the engineer. Cleaner, he said. Obviously. Tanton shook his head, perplexed. Nothing could penetrate this ship. As we stood contemplating, a lady's voice that sounded like a shop assistant came over the ceiling speakers. No need to be alarmed, ladies and gentlemen. Pirates attacked the Welkin, and some laser fire slipped inside an engine, but our defense system gunned the pirates down. The ship was built to withstand much worse damage. Please, return to your activities and have a pleasant journey. My body finally relaxed, all my muscles softening right down to the tendons. I gazed at Tanton. He was a fine young lad, innocent even, but it was the end of this rendezvous. I leaned away from the door, ready to part, and said, "Have a pleasant," but he grabbed my arm like he was a police sergeant ready for an arrest. It was clear to me he would not let me leave with the source rod in my pouch. I had to act. You're not going to like this, Tanton, I told myself, then balled my fingers into a fist and prepared my knuckles to meet the cleaner's jaw, a connection that would shake him with enough force to rival the pirate's attack. But as I prepared to strike him across his lips, he opened them and said, "The fire." So he's not concerned with the rod, I thought, but is only worried about the past. I relaxed my fist and patted his cheek. It'll burn out. Relax. We didn't die. He still clung to my arm as if it were a whiskey bottle, and he a drunkard. He pulled me into him so close that our noses were almost touching and said, "The hole in the glass." What? He stared into me with a gaze that radiated heat. If the fire burns through the hole in the glass, it could reach the rods and, he paused before finishing his sentence, perhaps because he was too afraid to say the words, but instantly his thoughts transferred to me and I finished the phrase for him, explode. Tanton nodded. Tear a hole in the engine. Although flames burned beyond the locked door behind us, scorching the metal surrounds of the engine room with its merciless heat. A cold shiver traveled through my body, as if my blood was morphing into snow. A greater threat loomed than a destroyed engine. If the explosions reach the engines, I told him, they'll ignite the main source rods and blow the back of the ship into shrapnel. We have to put the fire out. Tanton kept peering into me as if the scene was playing out in his mind, the horrid blast, the flames, the ship crumbling in space. He swallowed with a nervous tension I hadn't seen since the mob shot 3 microchip smugglers tied to chairs in my kitchen. Tanton and I nodded in unison, both knowing we had to face the flames and extinguish them. We faced the door, our hands trembling, and the closer our hands crept to the door handle, the more they shook. Please let the flames be out. Together we pushed the handle down. Who to trust? The door only opened 2 feet when the heat became too intense. A fiery yellow tore into the walls, as if the room were the belly of an angry volcano. We slammed the door as fast as I had done on the first occasion. We had to warn the captain and tell him to get the escape pods ready, all of them. But a part of me didn't want to, in case Tanton told about me cutting the glass and stealing the rod. The rod I still possessed in my pouch. The rod that would give me the death penalty. Could Tanton be trusted? It was impossible to know. He simply stood, erratic and nerve-riddled. Little choice remained. The captain, I said. We gotta tell him to prepare the escape pods, Tanton said. We scrambled down the corridor. Oh hell, oh flaming hell, the words ran through my mind as fast as our boots that slapped the floor. Throughout my life I had mastered the art of deception, playing the innocent girl in the light but doing whatever needed in the dark to achieve my own end. So much so that I felt I was the dark. A girl untraceable. Uncatchable. A girl who lived by her own rules. But now light burned on a realization. I was a weak and broken-spirited girl, deep in a hole surrounded by gang members and mobsters, so desperate to escape them that I had become them. We darted through a series of doors and up 2 flights of stairs, too afraid to take the elevators in case an explosion damaged them. After almost losing breath, we came to the captain's cabin. Tanton bashed a fist on the cabin's red door. We waited, catching our breaths in deep, heavy gasps. Tanton rapped the door again with a bang, 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 and then footsteps clumped toward us. Normally, you'd be desperate to tell the captain to prepare the pods so everyone could escape, but again, I was nervous over Tanton telling him the rod remained in my pouch. The door opened in a slow but deliberate manner, and standing before us was a bony man of about 30, who appeared a gust of wind could blow him across the floor. His parted hair ran at an angle, and his sideburns were shaved higher than his ears. It appeared the captain lacked a girlfriend, well at least a girlfriend who lacked taste for fashionable men. He stood blinking at the 2 of us. Ship's gonna explode, Tanton said amidst gasping breath. The captain twitched and scratched an elbow, the crest on his jacket reading Captain Morgan Rum. No, young man, he said in a tone worthy of a science geek. Our lasers destroyed the pirates. This boy needs to accept the situation. I stepped forward, and at the same time felt as if I were peeling layers of clothes off myself, leaving my body naked and the rod exposed. But it wasn't real, of course, it was only my conscience. The rod was hidden in my pouch. A fire broke into the engine room, I said, and then my throat swelled as if stung by a bee as I squeezed out the next words. There was a hole in the glass before the emergency rods. They'll detonate. Captain Morgan's eyes, which appeared they were smart to the point of being oblivious, twinkled with a hint of concern. How did a hole get in the glass? The question shivered my bones. It was not the most pertinent question at the moment. Surely that could be dealt with later. What we needed right now was to arm the escape pods and get everyone aboard. And as I opened my mouth to tell him, another explosion, bigger and meaner, shook the ship as if it entered a vicious black hole. All three of us clung to the door arc for balance. Then came a series of small eruptions, the noise from the end of the ship sounding like we were in a giant metal squasher, and part of the ship was being squeezed into a square no bigger than a lunchbox. The ship shook violently and threw the captain back through the doorway to where he landed flat on his bony backside, his crew falling around him, as if robots with their power source suddenly cut. Tanton's body planted into the doorframe, while I sailed through the archway like the gravity stabilizer had been switched off. I landed on the captain, my face smacking on his chest. There followed a blank stare as I lay half on top of him and peered straight up into his blinking eyes while he gazed down at me. Perhaps a position with a girl he'd never experienced. And I was greatly disturbed. The awkwardness didn't bother me. My upbringing with the mob had brought so many terrible situations that had scarred my life forever, and so I saw this as little more than children playing in a sandbox, and even the tremendous explosion did not have me most concerned. Once again, it was the rod in my pouch, for it rested right near, possibly even pressing into a very private part of Captain Morgan's anatomy, but I didn't care if he took a painful blow. I just felt he would somehow know I stole a rod, and there it was, the rod pressed right up against his, well, rod, you could say. After our awkward gaze, I decided we'd spent just about enough romantic time together, and I pushed off the captain. Instantly he rose with me, trying to neatly repart his mussed hair. After his hair failure, his face shattered to where his once ever-blinking eyes were now glued open, never to blink again. A crewman took the captain by the arm, and with a shaky voice he said, "The ship can't break apart. It can't." The captain scratched his right ear, then his left, and turning to stare out the cockpit window at the blackness of space and the corpus spread of white glowing stars said, "The Welkin will crumble. The source rods are interlinked. There will be more explosions." He turned to his three crew, took the deepest breath he could, then ordered, "Arm the pods." The three men froze, their wide eyes seemingly envisioning the ship they had probably worked their entire lives to pilot, roasting into flames and disintegrating into infinite space. The Welkin started vibrating, shuddering, quaking, and that moved the crew to begin pressing an array of buttons that must have been arming the pods. The captain faced the microphone and, while trembling as if electrodes ran through his wiry frame, started to announce for passengers to board the escape pods, but there wasn't time to listen to his commands. I turned around, faced Tanton and said, "I'm getting on a pod before they explode too." Then I barged past Tanton and ran out the door. It felt a little harsh dashing off on Tanton, but I was leaving this crumbling ship in a pod for Cerulean with my rod, regardless if he was gonna be the sacrificial gentleman and let others go first. But in less than a millisecond, Tanton was beside me. "Leaving without me," Tanton said, catching up, both of us dashing through a doorway and then another, searching for the pods. A double doorway brought us into the main dining room. The overhead lights continuously flickered, dancing horridly over the passengers as if in some heavy metal concert, while people scrambled madly for the pods on the far side of the ship. Men in dapper suits, who were supposed to be respectable, threw other men aside, and their ladies, perhaps worse, tore and clawed at each other as if wild monkeys with some inborn rabid disease. Tables were turned and chairs toppled, and all the fine cutlery was flung around the room, the tinkering adding to the howling screams, and what was the mad panic? There were enough pods if we all manned them calmly. Ahead, through the glass windows on the far side, the pods were visible. Bang bang ka bang. A triple burst of exploding rod fuel punished the far side of the ship. People were thrown back as if weightless. Balls of fire blew from the Welkin's side, clearly visible through the windows, mushrooming out in the dead black of space. Then an even more terrifying sight than fire. The oval-shaped escape pods wafted out into the dark void, twirling out of control as if baseball bats tossed by a struck-out batter, others blowing apart as pieces of shrapnel whirled out into the cosmos. Tanton and I quit our approach and stood zombified in the middle of the dining room, my dreams floating away with the pods. It felt as if all the blood had drained from my veins and numbed all my skin. Then my voice, feeling separate from my body, broke into lamentation. It's over. Our chance to escape gone. Tanton didn't answer, but stood beside me as people lay on the floor in the aftermath of the explosions. Some people were clearly dead, blood spread over their faces and bodies. Others, farther away from the side, struggled to stand only to watch in shocked horror as their precious pods twirled far, far away. For that moment all the screams stopped and muffled into silence. Soon all our lives would be snuffed out, either by the flames eating the ship alive, or being sucked into outer space through some hole caused by the explosion. Quickly the screams returned with a vengeance, howls, wails, bursts of anguish reeling from the deepest parts of men and women's throats. And then came the mad rush as people hollered, "There are some pods toward the back," and many more similar shouts rippled through the mob. The crowd pressed toward the rear passage, trying to squeeze through it like clogged sand through an hourglass. "We'll never reach a pod," Tanton said. I looked around in a daze, still coming to the realization of dying. Death, I thought, what a horrid state. An eternity of nothingness. And I won't just be dead, I'll be dead rich, with a rod in my pouch. I thought I'd escape my wretched life. Tanton faced me and unbelievably spoke calmly. Couldn't have been as terrible as mine. My mother from Mexico married a playboy from LA, and I soon came along. 5 years later my father upset the mob and sold us into slavery to save his own skin. I was raised by a horrible man called Pecora Ruiz. Until now I hadn't found a way out. Now that escape plan is vanishing. Between us, a moment of deathly silence. "Your mother," Tanton said, disappeared. Another temporary silence. "Sorry," Tanton said, and in the haze of the shouts and screams it felt as though his calm voice was actually sincere. "I wanted to be a farmer on Cerulean." His eyes drifted light years away as if he stood in his fields with his hands tracing through wheat stalks. "Grow vegetables and swim in the blue rivers. I heard they named the planet Cerulean due to the bright blue water." He gazed at me as if the water splashed his face. "Maybe you can come with me." Tanton's expressed hopes, wishes brought me into his sacred place. They were so simple, a life much less than I had planned for, but now amid our fiery death, his simple farm seemed almost a paradise. It would hurt to tell him we'd be dead in minutes. For some reason it stung me, and I just couldn't say it, and so I said the gentle word, "maybe." Then about 20 yards ahead, a little girl in a blue dress with blonde plaits tickling the tops of her shoulders stood crying. If she wasn't weeping, she might have been cute. But hang on, she was even better than cute, she was perfect. Perfect for an escape plan. I ran to her and swept her up into my arms, held her high and started charging toward the shoving crowd. Tanton caught up once again. "Where are you taking the girl?" "To board a pod," I told him, and reaching the array of people crammed before the side hall, I held the girl higher, calling, "Let me through. I have a girl. A girl." I even showcased her by turning on my feet in a circle as I held her aloft, but people cared for the child even less than me, and no one was giving up their positions to the remaining pods. And so I placed the child back on her feet. She stood staring at me, tearing eyes the color of cerulean waters. "I don't want to die." I ignored her. The answer was obvious, and she couldn't take it. Tanton broke through a pushing fancy-dressed couple and handed me a killer, judgmental gaze. "You're not your father," he said, and his words were a kick to my stomach. I resented my father, despised him even, and to be called him, to have acted like him, felt repulsive. Tanton knelt down before the child, brushed her hair. "Where are your parents?" he asked her, but the only response was tears streaming down her cheeks and a slight confused shake of her head. Her parents never came for her, so most likely they were among the many dead bodies lying by the burning wall. "You're not going to die," Tanton told her. His voice sweet, pure, so calming it could nearly extinguish fire. And the way he comforted the girl, perhaps for the first time in my life, sparked a gentle fire inside my heart. But it was all a lie. I stepped beside them and spoke as blunt as the situation. "Yes, she is." Tanton slowly turned to peer at me with his eyes the color of the wheat fields he dreamed of, and again delivered me the pejorative stare, and the little girl stared too with her wide blue eyes, and as she studied me, her face curled in, strange-like, the center of her eyebrows slightly raised as if she was wondering, who is this heartless woman? And Tanton kneeling and holding her hand, and the girl gazing longingly up at me, stoked the ember that Tanton had started in my heart. It felt for the first time someone was depending on me, trusting me. And I did not want to be my father and use the girl to save my own life. My boots steadied on the floor, and I seemed to find new courage, new hope. And it all caused me to offer my own lie. "Sorry, I was wrong," I said to the girl. "We'll get you off this ship." Tanton stood and gazed at me in such a different way, a way deep and pure as if my words were truth, and I felt a need to make them such. "How will we do that?" he said. Although the escape seemed impossible, with the weight of two depending on me, my mind felt like it shifted to a higher gear, a higher level of thought that would have otherwise never been attainable, and as I peered through the windows at the blackness and flames and pieces of the ship disappearing, and the pods heading out on their own, seemingly searching out into the darkness, it presented me with an idea. "The maintenance pods at the front of the ship," I said. Tanton's lightly bearded face contorted into a strange twist, hearing words he surely felt were a fable. "Them again. They don't exist." Oh, but they did. My heart started to race, but not out of panic, rather out of the hope I could still make it off this ship with these two. "My husband is friends with an engineer," I said. "I stole his key for the engine room." "You're married," Tanton said, eyes expanding while the little girl smiled for some strange reason. "Fiancé," I said, then waved off that discussion. "Point is, I heard them mention it. Trust me, there are maintenance pods." Tanton nodded. "Can they fly all the way to Cerulean?" "They're powered by source rods," I said, then felt my face flush ever so slightly as a rod remained in my pouch, but I pressed past that. "They'll easily make it from here. You simply step aboard, press the 10-second countdown release, then once you're out there floating in space, type in the coordinates and the pod will fly you to your bright blue-watered planet." With the plan settled, I faced the girl and asked, "What's your name?" "Katie." I was about to take her hand and say, "Let's get out of here," when Tanton stepped in before me and took Katie by the hand and said, "Katie, let's get off this ship." That was my moment. "You stole my words." Holding Katie's hand, Tanton took off, yelling over his shoulder, "And your identity shield." With a huff, I followed. Passengers scramble for the side rear of the ship, hoping to find an undestroyed pod while we arrowed through the middle of the herd, almost getting trampled in the stampede. The smell of fire and smoke and fuel burning drifted through the ship, and added more panic to the already incredibly intense situation. Soon the dining room also smelled of blood. Upon approaching the exit door, we stumbled upon a group of dead people lying across the floor, skin blistered and burned. Fire licked up the wall in ruthless rage, and as we walked past the bodies, Katie started trembling, and for the first time she reached out and grabbed my hand. It was a strange touch, a little girl searching for comfort, her hands gripping mine in anguish. "Don't look at them," I said to her as we began to pass the people. Stepping past lifeless hands and feet, there was an irresistible urge to count the people, 2, 3, 4 people whose lives were gone. I had seen so many deaths in my life, but these seemed more haunting, as they reflected what could become of us. I forced that morbid thought away, and my consciousness slipped to the pods again, and all 3 of us cramming aboard. "We will not die," I told myself, "we will live." Undeterred, we arrived at the end of the dining room, where the frosted glass exit door was stuck, edged open, but through it we squeezed. We darted by the central foyer, past elaborately carved wooden chairs and tables, and came to the next frosted glass door. Tanton pressed the release button, but the door was jammed shut. "It's broken," he said, thumping the wall. Time didn't allow for being frustrated, and so I did what I had done a few times in my early teens, robbing jewelry stores in Calexico. I picked up a wooden chair, raised it high over my shoulder, said, "Stand back," and swung the chair into the glass. It bounced off, clattering onto the ground, leaving the glass unscratched. "Laser-proof glass," Tanton said. "Great," I said belatedly and kicked the door, now finding the time for frustration. But Tanton gathered the chair, and now he held it aloft, ready to have his own crack at the glass. "Surely you don't think you can swing harder than me?" I said. "Nope," Tanton said, but regardless he swung away. He swung the chair like a baseball player trying to knock a ball out of the park. But he did not swing the chair into the glass door. Instead, he swung the piece of furniture right beside the glass and crashed the wooden legs into the release button. A leg fell off the chair in a single plop, and Tanton dropped the remains of the furniture. Now in front of us sat the release button with its casing dangling loose. Tanton peered at the broken case, then pulled my identity shield from his pocket. I scratched my head, bewildered at him. Tanton ripped the casing completely off, revealing the little operational lasers. Then he stuck my identity shield in the casing, reflecting the laser beams, seemingly knowing an awful lot for a cleaner. A cleaner knowing about lasers? I said. Aced laser physics in class, Tanton said, and then the door buzzed and slid open. Tanton stowed my identity shield back in his pocket, and I said I might be needing that, and he replied, so might I. Then he smiled at me almost like a young man in love. Don't look at me like that, I thought. Do not gaze at me like we're going to be lovers when we're likely to die. Ignoring his smile, I stepped through the doorway with Katie, then Tanton took my trailing hand and came through to meet me. He gazed at me again with those wheat-field eyes, seemingly searching for a kiss. He had only known me a few minutes, how quickly fools fall in love. But I leaned away from him in refusal, but then he leaned into me and said, funny. Idiot. This situation hardly seems funny. I opened this door for you, but you were gonna close the door on me in the engine room with the fire. But he thought I saved him. You already thanked me for waiting for you. He stared at me, smiling smugly like he caught me out. I lied so you wouldn't try to kill me again. Again. The wrench to the head trick. Oh right. I raked a hand through my hair, awkwardly. Well, it would have been your fault if I slammed the door in your face. You moved too slow. Here's a move that ain't slow, he said, and despite my shuffling backward, managed to somewhat awkwardly put his arms around my neck and lean in and kiss me. I did not kiss him back. But I did not try to stop him, and I certainly wasn't about to slam a door in his face. His subtle beard tickled softly, and his lips were soft and warm. A warmness that touched a side of me that always felt unreachable. I had been kissed too many times. But not this way. It felt as if he actually cared. I shut my eyes, and for the moment, I could have stood there and let him kiss me until the flames ended us, because this was a rare moment of peace, and there was little chance we'd even reach the maintenance pods. I crept my eyes open and touched his cheek, and through the kiss teased, "That's barely a beard." He broke away, gently gazed at me. Man growth. Then our moment was disturbed. "Evita," a voice said in a surprised but vicious tone. The voice was clearly recognizable. I looked past Tanton to the door that was edged open at the dining room. At the doorway stood Dante, my fiancé. A ship burns, a jealousy burns. Dante's dark eyes boiled like black lava, shrouded by his long dark hair. His rough beard bordered his lips, which were quivering from the intensity of his anger. "I've been searching for you," he said. "But it seems you've already been found." Tanton's face brushed against mine as he turned to look upon my betrothed. There wasn't much room to see Dante between the wall and the jammed door, but it was enough to show him pull a black laser gun from beneath his red leather jacket, stick it through the frosted glass door, and take aim. With barely time to react, Tanton yelled "down" and dove over me as a shot fired out. The pow of the laser, although not near as loud as the explosions, scared me more, as I did not hear a laser spank into the wall nor did I feel it enter my body, and so there was the chance Tanton was struck. He lay over the top of me as we lay on the floor, his eyes looking into my eyes, and I tried to read them for a moment to see if they held the shock of being shot, of having a laser tear through your body. There was none of that with Tanton. No terror nor alarm. His eyes showed relief. But there was no enjoying the comfort of the hard floor. Dante would be coming. "Close the door," I shouted, and before Tanton could climb off me, Katie, who stood behind the wall, smacked the button and the door started to slide shut. A pow-pow followed as Dante fired 2 shots, but both punched into the glass door, leaving a scorched flame. I rolled out from underneath Tanton as the door was closing, and caught a glimpse of the hatred in Dante's eyes as his laser pointed front and center for my head. It wasn't the first time the barrel of a laser gun had stared at me. That had happened twice before. But they were empty threats from weak mobsters who had no stranglehold in Calexico and feared the repercussions of pulling the trigger. With Dante, it was different. There were no consequences. Fortunately, the door slammed shut as another laser spanked the glass. Tanton jumped up and quickly grabbed yet another chair, and in a mad hurry swung it into the door buzzer. The cap busted off, and as quick as a lion on a meal, he tore out my identity shield and reflected the lasers around the casing. Lasers danced in blue and red and yellow, followed by a puff of smoke. "The door's now jammed shut," Tanton said. Tanton, Katie and I stood staring at the frosted glass door, the only thing between us and Dante. The sound of his footsteps paced along the floor until his blurred image met the door. The outline of his red jacket showed his arms straight down by his side. The anger that would be raging inside his head would almost match the rage of the fire tearing through the back of the ship. Tanton, Katie, and I huddled into one another. Dante leaned forward until his forehead pressed against the glass, revealing his dark eyes. He stared at me, then slowly peered at Tanton. In a sudden, swift outburst, he slammed a fist into the glass. "No one betrays me," he said, voice briefly adding a touch of fog to the frosted glass. "If I'm dying on this ship, first I'm gonna kill." Then his voice trailed off and fell into silence as he gazed blankly into space. A light had ignited in his mind, and it was obvious he had discovered why we were scrambling to the front of the ship. They were his friends' pods, after all. "You're going for a maintenance pod," he said, and we didn't answer him. Instead, I took Tanton's hand in one of mine and took Katie's in the other, and began to walk away, heading for the front of the ship. As our feet trod over the polished floor in a determined yet nervous march, we heard the threatening scream of Dante, "That's my pod." His voice shook Katie, and I said to the little girl, "Ignore his screams." "So he's the husband," Tanton said. "Ex-fiancé," I said, and released his hand momentarily to twiddling my fingers as I had done when stealing the rod. It's how I really thought my fingers were destined to save me. Slip on a gold ring, suck him into taking me to another world. We entered the ship's kitchen, where cutlery and plates and pots and vegetables for this evening's meal were spread around the shelves and floor, as if a Category 5 hurricane had swept through. Then, while walking with the two, I felt something warm trickle onto the hand that held Tanton's, and it wasn't a warm, fuzzy feeling. Interlacing between our clasped hands dripped a thin rill of blood. The crimson brook ran up Tanton's arm to where his rolled-up sleeves stopped at his bicep. A patch of red stained his shirt about half a palm in width. I stopped us under another flickering light. "You're shot," I said to Tanton. He stepped forward, trying to move us on. "Only in the arm." But I stopped him from moving with a swift jerk of his arm, which, as you would guess, made him yell, "Ouch! That's my shot arm." That was an accident, but with good intentions. "I've seen laser wounds," I said, then took a steak knife from off the floor and quickly cut a hole in his sleeve near the blood. A quick tug with my hands saw the sleeve torn apart, revealing the bloody wound. Although it appeared nasty, blood and flesh exposed from the edge of his upper arm, a wave of relief swept through me. "No vital arteries severed," I said. "The laser only tore a piece from your triceps." "You're lucky." He winced. "Don't feel lucky." But something perplexed me, his earlier expression. "Why did you look relieved after you were shot?" I said. "When you dove on me." "Because we were alive." That gave me the warm fuzzy feeling, and I stood a little dazed. Someone was happy to take a shot for me, just to keep me safe. As I stood caught in reflection, Katie stood staring at Tanton's bloody arm, clutching her hands to her heart. "Is he going to die?" "No," I said, facing her. "None of us are." I paused for a moment, realizing I'd uttered the complete opposite of my first words to her. "The wound needs cauterizing, but a strip of material will suffice for now." After a quick search, I took a blue checkered tea towel off a bench, cut it in half with a steak knife, and to the groans and painful grunts of Tanton and complaints of ARH and careful, I fastened the strip of cloth around his arm, secure with a double knot. I tapped Tanton's shoulder and said, "All better?" "Sort of." We made eye contact, and our connection felt stronger than even at the kiss, because in gaining the wound, he had acted to protect me, and I sort of helped him with his arm, and Katie stared at both of us, and she had pressed the button to close the door on Dante, and so, in a way, we had all saved one another. Standing in that mess of a kitchen surrounded by celery and tomatoes and beetroot and fresh chicken spread all over with the pots and pans and the light flickering above, glistening over the unblinking eyes of Tanton, it gave me a thought. Escaping with these two will be a better life than escaping on my own. Perhaps for the first time since Mother vanished, I could have a real family. A warm smile started to creep to my lips when footsteps sounded on the other side of the wall. We all stopped and listened. The footsteps were not stampeding for an exit, so it was not a scared passenger, nor the captain skipping around in panic ready to go down with the ship. No, rather the footsteps trod ever so slowly, creeping, prowling. Steps of a stalker. "Dante," I whispered, and I faced Katie and touched my finger to my lips, indicating quiet. The footsteps edged a little farther away until they stopped. For a moment I hoped he had left us, heading to the back of the ship for a chance at a remaining pod. But then came the sound of a tremendous clanging, as if a waiter had dropped an entire tray of plates and cutlery. Katie released a scream before muffling it with her hands. We stood silently. Did Dante hear Katie? "Evita!" Dante's voice rattled from behind the wall. As soon as he spoke, I shifted my eyes toward the kitchen exit door, and all three of us crept toward it. "I hear you, Evita," Dante cried. "Give up. I'll beat you to the pods, and I'll release one unmanned and leave the other just for me. But if you hand yourself over, I won't shoot your friends. And we can escape to Cerulean together." His voice made me sick to the point of vomiting. There was no way I was leaving Tanton and Katie for a life with him. With a quick push of the door button, the kitchen door slid open and we walked through, coming to an elaborately decorated corridor that housed the rich guest rooms. We kept moving through the passage, distancing ourselves from Dante, heading toward another glass door where behind it bright lights streamed, reminiscent of a circus. Opening the door, we entered the gaming room. Ranged along the walls was a vast array of gaming machines, popping lights in all colors. Some machines stood straight like soldiers awaiting orders, while others were turned over, toppled from the shakings of the ship. Roulette tables were spread around the room, and one wheel had been flung from the explosion and rested on the floor only a few strides away. Amazingly, the metal ball rested in its trap, stopped at the number 1. The number triggered the idea that only one of us would escape this ship. There was no way I was going to let that one be Dante, and less of a chance that I was going to escape on my own and be that one, leaving my two newfound friends behind. No, 3 were gonna leave this ship. If we could beat Dante to the pods. I stood for a moment, wondering if Dante was taking a shortcut to the pods. And if he found us on the way, what would he do? Well, he had the laser gun. Then from the kitchen behind us came another boom. Big and loud and mean. The corridor shook and trembled, and sharp bits of metal and glass and lights rained from the ceiling. Then the alarms blared a horrid beep. Beep, and I knew what it meant, for we had been prepared for it before boarding the ship, although we were told we would only hear it once in testing, never again. It meant, "The ship's losing oxygen," I said. The Welkin had most likely been blown apart at its rear, and the oxygen would soon drain away, bleed out like a killed rabbit strung up. The door to the gaming room started to slide shut automatically, safety mechanisms to lock in the remaining places of air. Moments later, the flickering lights above winked out. Not happening, not happening, not happening. It was so dark and cramped and crowded with tables and gaming machines that it felt like we were rats in a scrambled maze. The only lights were of some live machines, dazzling the area with blues, yellows, and reds like some high-tech nightclub. We started to make our way through the jumble. "The maintenance pods aren't much farther," I said. "Hope they have a bed," Katie said as her body drooped. "The pods are too small," I said. Tanton slowed his walk until he came to a complete stop. A glimmer came over him, as if he detected something wrong, amiss. "How many people do the pods hold?" Tanton asked. The pod's size never occurred to me. 2, I said. Katie stared up at us, the terror in her eyes already compounded by the loss of her parents. Tanton swallowed, shifting glances between me and the girl. "When we get to the pod, if we can't all fit," he said, "I'll travel on my own." It was an honorable suggestion to fly solo, for it would be lonely. Katie shook her head, having none of it. All of us together, or none of us. Her voice was so innocent in this burning ship, and there was plenty I wanted to say to her, tell her all the cool things we could do once we made our new home in Cerulean, like riding horses and planting trees, and that her parents would be happy she was safe. All that had happened to us during these intense moments had seemed to bring us together and melt us into a single unit. But there was little time to release my feelings, and so looking down at her, I simply smiled and said, "We'll make it fit." Katie gazed at Tanton and I with a certain joy and hope, her eyes saying, "I trust you." The moment of solace ended quickly. Another rattling came from above. We stopped beside a turned-over roulette table and looked around, trying to decipher where the noise emanated from. And then, there, Tanton whispered in my ear and pointed his arm across my line of vision. He led my eyes to the ceiling in the corner of the casino. Up above, a square vent rattled. Shimmied. The vent fell from the ceiling to the floor in a quick clump. The vent left a dark hole in the ceiling. Moments later, a group of fingers gripped the opening's edges, and then Dante's head slowly lowered upside down through the hole, his black hair hanging wildly untamed. Although hair draped his face, his sinister eyes were visible, spotlighted by a flickering red light of a gaming machine. He was traveling through the air vents, and that was the earlier sound from the kitchen. Rattled as what to do, we all ducked behind the roulette table. Quickly I motioned again for Katie not to make a sound, and I prayed this time if Dante made any sudden noises, she would not scream. But with Katie appearing to be as calm and ready as could be expected of a young girl fleeing from two life-threatening dangers, the exploding ship and Dante, Tanton and I gave each other a nod, understanding that we were gonna have to do something about my former fiancé. Slowly, as a team, Tanton and I edged our heads above the table, eyes poking over the wooden trim. Still hanging upside down, Dante inspected the little casino room. One of his hands slipped away from the hole, and soon returned holding the laser gun. He pointed it around the room in all directions, I following the sight. It wasn't clear who he was aiming at, either searching for us to take a shot, or maybe he presumed we were watching him from some dark corner, and perhaps he thought Katie might gasp in terror over the sight of the laser, or that we could make a sudden dash for the door. Gladly, he didn't scare any of us into rash action. But unfortunately, the door was across the other side of the room. A mad dash through a crowd of tables of blackjack and roulette and craps baccarat, and various forms of poker to content the most avid gambler. And so the run was out of the question, for we would be an easy target for Dante to laser us down. Hidden in the shadows, Tanton and I watched on. What was Tanton thinking? Did he want to make the run? Maybe, because time was running out on 3 accounts, the ship would either explode or burn all the way to us, and the oxygen was locked down in our room, but you could sense it seeping out, thinning, becoming a little harder to breathe, and soon all oxygen would evaporate. We cannot stay here forever, I thought. We must do something. Dante snuck his head back in the hole, completely gone, vanished. But it brought no respite because quickly, his black boots started wriggling out of the hole, feet appearing like he was dancing to music. His black leather pants stretched down until his black, shiny belt was visible. He was lowering himself into the room. In one swift motion, his torso came down with his red t-shirt caught on the vent opening, exposing his dark, chiseled stomach. He hung onto the ceiling with his hands, then fully lowered himself until he released the sides of the opening and dropped right on top of a small poker table. It tilted and Dante spilled over onto the floor, engulfed by a whirlwind of playing cards. Laughter tried mercilessly to burst its way up from the deepest parts of my stomach and out of my mouth, and surely Tanton felt the same, but both of us held our nerve and held in our chuckles. Quickly, most likely to regain his pride as much as his vision of the room, Dante bounced back to his feet, and with a quick tug of his jacket and shirt and a rake of a hand through his hair, he was ready to hunt. "Surprise attack blown," he said, looking around the room for a glimpse of us. None of us said a thing or moved a muscle. Katie huddled quietly into her hands and knees as if playing hide-and-seek. I guess she was. Dante breathed air in through his nostrils, deep and long. I smell your perfume, Evita, he said. Come out, and we'll negotiate. He held the laser beside the trimmings of his beard, ready to shoot, appearing like a spy. He slowly began creeping toward the back of the casino, past the table he toppled. Fitting, I'm searching for you in the casino, Dante said. You know I always win. His words struck me like a gambler who threw all his money on red and lost. Dante was insane over winning. I'd once seen him cut a Cuban man's hand off for a Rolex that he wouldn't hand over after losing poker. There was no way Dante was going to negotiate anything other than another shot into Tanton, and one or two into me, and leave Katie to die aboard the ship. I quickly hatched a makeshift escape plan inside my head, crawl beneath the muddled tables toward the doorway without being seen. As for what could go wrong, pretty much everything. I lowered myself behind the table and caught eyes with Tanton and Katie. Trying to communicate the escape with no speech, I nodded toward the route below the tables that led to the doorway. Hopefully Tanton and Katie understood. Katie, anxious to leave, went to creep away, but I grabbed her arm and shook my head no. It was not time yet. We had to wait until Dante moved away from the line of vision that led to the door. Tanton and I peeped over our turned-over table again and watched Dante. Ever so slowly he crept on a veering angle toward our exit. Damn him, I thought. Walk another way. We couldn't move yet. Well, not in the direction toward the front. Instead, we had to move back around. Dante crept closer to our line of vision, and I nodded for us to creep behind the other side of our table, and as quietly as possible, us three crept on all fours around the table until we were out of Dante's sight. The only thing that could see us was a gaming machine in arm's reach, lying on its side and blinking its little lights as if in distress. I poked my head around the side of the table, and there was Dante, standing amidst a dizzying array of gaming machine light, a hand with a taut grip on the laser. Evita, he said, voice tense. Evita, negotiate. Veins bulged from the side of his neck after his outburst, then his anger got the better of him, and he fired random shots around the room, pow pow pow, the laser firing multiple blue strips of light, spanking tables and crashing into a gaming machine, decorating the dark with an array of yellow sparks. Then spank, one shot punctured the table just ahead of ours, and Katie gasped. Dante stopped firing. A silence followed where only the dying buzz of the shot-up gaming machines could be heard fading and waning into an agonizing death. Come out, little girl, Dante hollered. I'll bring you aboard the maintenance pod with me. The brute of a man was using the girl to get to us. My anger for him quickly gave judgment to myself, as only a few minutes earlier I had tried the same, holding Katie up to try use her to board a pod. But time for disciplinary self-talk could wait. It was now time to ensure Katie did not trust Dante. I met eyes with the child and shook my head no, no. Do not run to Dante. Katie's wide gaze seemed to trust me still. I hoped. Don't trust them, little girl, Dante said. The pod can only hold two, and neither of those cheating, conniving adults want you cramping their love affair. They will fly off without you. Katie had heard us say the pod could only fit two, so it was a half-convincing argument. Still again, I shook my head no at my new small friend. Dante stopped talking, waiting for a response, but none came. My breath started getting tighter, squeezing my lungs. At first I blamed it on the moment's tension, but soon remembered oxygen slowly leaked from the ship, making it pertinent that we quickly move to the maintenance pods. Dante or not. Laser or not. Dante got on the prowl again, and his steps traveled down the casino, slowly, deliberately creeping toward us, his eyes scouring the room. We were gonna have to move because eventually he would walk right into us, and we'd be an easy shot on all fours. The row of tables stretched ahead, almost reaching the exit door. The dark gave the slightest possibility that we could crawl out beneath them unseen. But what about the noise? Our hands and feet and knees clumping away. Surely he'd hear us. If only we could play some loud music. Then I saw the only thing that could make a decent racket, lying on its side before me, spewing out a range of technicolored images, the working gaming machine. I motioned with my hand to Tanton and Katie to ready themselves, then pointed down the row of tables, then gave them a flat hand to indicate wait a second. I hoped they understood my uncoordinated directions. With a quietness that would make any thief proud, I wriggled my hands into my pants pocket and pulled out Dante's money card. All that was required was to simply swipe it past the machine and it would start, and hopefully be noisy. I reached for the machine, but Dante took a few steps to his left and came directly into my line of sight, and I pulled my hand back. Wait. Us three stayed on all fours, lingering, delaying, a taut silence gripping the room. The air grew thinner. Dante coughed, obviously noticing he had to suck in the air. Finally, Dante broke direction and turned the other way. In a flash, I swiped the card over the machine. It blinged on in a blaze of noise, sounding like an energetic robot. Having passed hours on these machines in Calexico, I pressed the buttons that sent it to automatic, and away it went, rattling, banging, gurgling, making all sorts of chaotic sounds as it gobbled Dante's money. It'd keep spinning through the cards until it got a winner, if ever. Now time to move. Tanton and Katie understood my plan, and I led our crawl under the row of tables that led toward the door. I had never crawled so fast in my life. Never really had a need for it until now. How often does one need to crawl to save their life? It was a haze under the tables. Air was drawing thin, table legs obstructed the path, darkness pervaded except the occasional flash of color from machines, and it all made it impossible to see Dante's feet, to spot his location. I kept peering left where he was last positioned, but couldn't locate him. My breath tightened further. Did he see us take off, and is now waiting at the end of the row of tables, ready to shoot us one by one as we emerge? Anything was possible, and there was no telling but also no stalling, and so we crawled on. Shadows drifted all around the casino, accompanied by the noise of the running machine, bling, bling, blinging its little heart out. We came to the end of the row of tables, to where a 10-yard dash awaited to reach the door. But another timber table sat to our left, turned on its side, impossible to see behind. Knowing conniving Dante, it could be a perfect place for him to prepare an ambush. I flashed my hand back and stopped Katie and Tanton at the table's edge. What to do? And then the pow of the laser gun, as Dante shot the noisy gaming machine at the end of the room. He'd been lured to the far end, and that gave us a chance. Tanton and I took Katie's hand, and we crawled out from the table, scurrying on all fours like cockroaches. Upon reaching the door, the rod in my pouch jutted free from the bumpy crawling. Thankfully, the impact to the floor was minimal, and the rod didn't explode. Tanton stood and pressed the door button. The glass slid back, and I grabbed the rod and snuck through the door. I turned to see Dante standing at the far end. He stared at the rod in my hand, eyes emboldened and quivering, and said, "That rod will be worth a fortune on Cerulean." One thing that Dante could be more than a killer was greedy. Now that he'd seen the rod, there was no chance he'd let anyone have it other than himself. He raised his laser, but I ducked behind the wall, evading harm's way. But Tanton, standing on the other side of the doorway with Katie, was not yet behind cover. Quickly he shielded his body over Katie as another shot zapped the air, and after the sound of the blast, a flash of red blood splashed from Tanton's thigh. He stumbled into the room, bringing Katie with him. I pressed the door button, sliding it shut. Dante wasn't done. Blue laser shots zapped through the doorway, zooming by our heads. Other lasers struck the glass, leaving scorched marks of black. When the door closed, once again, Tanton smashed open the button casing with a chair, and disabled the door with my identity shield and kept Dante locked out. Dante arrived just in time to thump the closed glass, breathing a heavy fog over the already frosted door. Slowly I slipped the rod into my pouch, while Dante's eyes followed it like a heat-seeking laser. Surely he would say something, vent some morbid threat of death. But he stayed silent, watching, thinking, then he turned and walked away with his image vanishing. It seemed he would be back. A final breath. Tanton stood breathing heavily. Signs the Welkin was losing its supply of breathable air, and signs of his recovery from our strenuous escape from Dante. There was also the added burden of Tanton's wounds, the laser shot to his triceps, and now the wound upon his thigh, his unfashionable pants torn into even less fashion. Despite his lack of style, he needed care. I quickly ripped his shirt open, popping buttons and pulling the shirt off, leaving his body bare. "Not in front of the child," he said, jokingly implying I was searching for romance. "Settle down," I told him, then quickly inspected the laser shot on his leg. "Not deadly." I wrapped his shirt around his thigh, pulling the knot tight. "Another flesh wound," I told him, and then leaving the bandage, I stood to meet eyes. A part of me wanted to hug and kiss him. Kiss him because he had kissed me the first time, and on this occasion I wanted to be the instigator. The craving burned within me, because he shielded Katie with his own body. Never had I seen a man defend others with their own flesh. But it's hard to kiss when you're running out of time, running out of air, running away from a gangster, and I refrained from doing so. "You're a lucky man. For meeting you," he said. "Or escaping death." "Both." Although obviously referring to his life. "Well," Tanton said, eyes glancing at his arm and leg, the stains of red branding the bandages, "I haven't escaped death yet." He gazed at me again. This time there was no cockiness that had been ever present over these last hectic moments, but a look of concern, a frightening expression in his eyes that said he might not make this. But also an earnest look. "But you will," he said, then he touched Katie's hair. "You and Katie." "No," I thought. "You're not dying on me." I grabbed him by his shoulders, and he winced because I knocked his triceps wound. Then I said, "Sorry, but we are all making it off this ship. All of us." Katie smiled unconvincingly at me, and Tanton nodded. It was doubtful either of them believed me. But the air drawing thin left no more time for convincing arguments, and I pointed forward. Just a dash through the corridor past the rooms, and we're there. Together we left the casino, and charged by a bar where bottles of alcohol were spilled and broken, leaving splashes of liquor over the floor, and we quickly tore down the hall. Soon, the corridor started losing more air, leaking out through the ship's ventilation system, and it felt like an eternity heading through the passageway. "Hurts my chest," Katie said. Tanton and I shared a worried glance. If we didn't find the pods, then we were facing our final moments. An image of Katie running out of breath, and lying dead on the ground with Tanton and me soon collapsing with her barraged into my mind. It was horrid, perhaps the most gut-wrenching feeling of my life. I ran to keep them alive. Our route mazed through twisting corridors, their walls adorned with paintings and gold-rimmed mirrors, until we went through another doorway and faced the sweetest sight, the extension that housed the pods, a narrow glass passage that stretched forward over the ship, about 20 yards long with an arched top. At the end of the passage and under the glow of a light rested 2 pods, one either side. We stepped onto the solid floor and walked a short passage to the pods. All around us the incredibly strong glass gave a breathtaking view of the uncountable array of stars freckling the cosmos, in an eternity of peace. I pressed my hands to the glass and looked back. The remains of the ship smoked and burned in wafts of fire and fury, while pieces and chunks of the Welkin floated off into the universe. Men and women, who had been blown from the ship, floated lifelessly in the cold eternal abyss. "Lungs hurting," Katie said, looking up at me, gasping for air. I gasped along with her, feeling the same pain in my chest. "Let's leave this ship," I said. Tanton nodded, and I kept fast hold of Katie's hand and faced a pod. The pods were small, egg-shaped vessels no bigger than a tall man. One half solid glass for seeing where you're going, while the small engines sat neatly on the back. The pods were joined to the passage by the glass half, a half-egg-shaped shield of glass before them. I pressed the door button to open the glass shield. My fingers edgily tapped beside the pod's automatic release button as the door slowly opened toward us. "Hurry up, door," I grumbled. But the door opened painstakingly slowly, as if an army of snails pulled it with rope tied to their shells. "Maybe it's damaged," I said. "Let's try the other one." We stepped across the passage to the other pod. I snuck in front of Tanton and Katie, and went to press the next door button. Then pow, a blue laser flashed above our heads, crashing into the light and igniting a small fire. "Where's the rod?" Dante's voice traveled toward us like a laser itself. He crept out the side of the passage entry, eyes beating through his mussed hair. Slowly he stepped forward, holding the laser steady on us, all the while his bearded face smeared with a sick smile. It was clear the only reason we were still alive was that he didn't know where the rod was on me, and a shot could ignite it, and I stood in front of Tanton and Katie. But surely with the ship about to blow apart, and the air failing, he had some sanity. "We can take a pod each and escape," I said, right as the slow door on the other side completed opening. The fire above reflected in Dante's squinted eye, that lowered right behind the laser gun sights. "1 inch toward the pod and I'll shoot holes in you all. Girl included." Katie gripped my hand tighter, a frightened grasp of a child. "Don't be insane," I said to Dante, remaining in front of Tanton and Katie. "The ship's about to blow. Let's just leave." He shook his head slowly, keeping close aim. "Give me the rod and you can leave with me," Dante said, then his lip dropped into a snarl portraying an angry mobster. "But that boy who can't grow a beard isn't." He nodded, for me to move out of the line of fire. "Step aside." He was going to shoot Tanton, no matter what I said. Even standing in front of Tanton, Dante would shoot through me if necessary. It gave me little option. I did not want to reveal the rod. Part of me still wanted every ounce of money it was worth. But it had to be sacrificed. I plucked it from my pouch, and in a flash of my hand, I held it up toward the small embers of fire that burned above, threatening to plunge the source rod into the flame. "Shoot either of them," I said in my nastiest voice, "and this rod goes into the fire. Shoot me and I drop it and it explodes." Dante's eyes amplified. 2 things would have startled him. 1, the fact if the rod touched the flame we all would be disintegrated, and 2, he desired the rod's riches. Greed crawled over every inch of his body. You could almost see the green monster. But I wanted the rod almost as much, perhaps more. Dante had as much money as the burning hell of this ship had heat, and he already had all the best houses and shuttles that man could afford. But me, on the other hand, I needed a life, to get away from him, and finally be free of the mob. This rod signified my life. It was my life. So it pained like breaking my own ribs when I said the words, "Let us leave and you can have it." Then I pressed the door button. "We take 1 pod. You and the rod take the other." As my words spewed out of my mouth, it felt like I was vomiting, heaving my very soul from my stomach. But after that initial rush of sickness subsided, much like real nausea, a soothing calm swept over my body, because I defended a small girl and an honorable young man. And life with them on Cerulean, Katie's laugh, Tanton's smile, and perhaps that next kiss, would be so much better than life alone with all the riches. And so it was done. My new life would not be materially rich, but people rich. Dante blinked, considering my offer. Surely it would be too good for him to turn down. He couldn't resist the rod. "Just give it to me," he said. I shook my head, waved the rod by the flame. "We need a deal." "You won't plunge it into the flame," he said. "You'll kill the girl." I glanced down at Katie, and she looked up at me. Her eyes were so strong for such a small girl, and in imitation of me, she shook her head no, and it was obvious what that meant, and so I said her words, "All of us together or none of us." And Katie squeezed my hand with a calmness. Dante released an angry sigh that sounded like a lizard hissing. "I'll take the rod," he said, then as I began to lower it from the flicker of flame, he quickly turned the laser and pow, shot a blue streak into the pod's door and automatic release button. It sparked, then burned a fire. The door was stuck slightly ajar, enough to squeeze through, but with the release button damaged, it would short-circuit the inside countdown button, and the pod could never leave. Then Dante added, "But the janitor and girl stay behind." "You're heartless," I said, and the rabid gleam in his eye confirmed it. He was relentless, not even allowing us to leave once he had the rod. There is no way out of this, I thought. Dante has won. He always wins. He commenced his approach and crept ever forward, black boots making an eerie clink-clank as he stepped heel to toe, heel to toe. In a moment he would be upon us, and there would be no chance of escaping in the pod. Once he was close enough to ensure his shots would not damage the rod and he could catch it before my dead body dropped the power source, he'd kill us all, and that would be it. There was only one thing I could think of doing. I slowly waved the rod in a circle, threatening to drop it, and then placed it back toward the flame, threatening to ignite it. Dante smiled, believing it as hollow threats, but it was all distraction, not threats. Slyly I tapped Tanton's hand, then pointed toward the release button aflame, hoping he read my thoughts. Dante crept closer, eyes focused on the rod and the flame, ready to shoot me if I plunged it higher. But with Dante's eyes so absorbed, he wasn't watching Tanton, and Tanton's hand slipped out behind me and stuck my identity shield in the release button's fire and reflected great light into Dante's eyes. "Arg!" Dante called and ducked his head. It allowed time enough for us three to jump the passage and scramble behind the opened glass door and use it as a shield. Dante blazed away. The shield soaked up a barrage of laser fire, blue streaks blasting against it as flames burst out the side of the door. Dante pushed ever forward into the corridor. The shield gave us time, but soon he would leap out from behind the door and have us exposed. The maintenance pod was opened before us, a tight squeeze for three and an uncomfortable journey to Cerulean, but it was possible. But something was impossible. "There's no time to allow for the 10-second countdown," I said. "One would have to stay in the corridor and press the automatic release button. All three of us could not escape. One must stay behind." It did not take long for me to make a decision. "Tanton," I said to him in a voice resembling a commanding officer, "get Katie inside the pod." Tanton took her hand but was hesitating to leave without me. "I'll follow, pressing the release button as soon as you're in," I said, then nodded toward the opening, my most serious expression. It was clear Tanton knew there would be no time to scoot in. He stood there, lasers blasting on the edge of the door in spits and spats. Tanton edgily stared toward the corridor. It appeared he was about to rush out and tackle Dante in an attempt to get me and Katie off the ship. But he'd never make it. Dante would shoot him. Tanton let go of Katie and took a step forward. That was as far as he made it. I had always dreamed of creating a life just for me. A life where I could have everything, and no one else mattered, nor could they interfere. Now it had turned to the complete opposite, a split decision to sacrifice my life for another, two others. "You two will not die," I thought. "You both will live." I sprang from the door and shoved into Tanton and Katie. And despite longing to swim beside him in the waters of Cerulean, I said, "Sorry, I can't go with you." My face pressed against Tanton's cheek. Our final touch. One that would stay with me for my brief remaining eternity. Then I pushed them both back into the pod. Tanton fell inside the maintenance pod with Katie calling out Evita, but I slammed the pod's shield closed, locked it, then stepped aside and pressed my hand to the release button. With an echoing zung, out shot the pod. In the glimpse I had of it leaving, it left me with an image unforgettable. Tanton banging his fists on the glass, Katie crying with enough tears to fill the Cerulean rivers. But it was not a sad image, not for me. Seeing them escape to freedom gave me a feeling of life I could never imagine. Then Dante grabbed me and slammed me into the glass wall. The glass didn't break, but I felt one, perhaps two of my ribs crack. "You saved them and killed yourself," Dante said right in my face, the anger in his voice matching the flames. Fire gusted out of the ship behind us, proliferating into space. It would soon burn us into nothing. Dante turned to see it, the fire reflecting in his eyes. His eyes at once trembled with fear and a hatred of me. He peeled me off the glass and swung me around, nearly pulling my arm from its socket. Swiftly he snapped his arm around my throat, ready to squeeze what little air remained in my lungs. He then put the laser to my temple, forced me to look at the onrushing flames that were about to swallow our glass passage. "I'm gonna shoot you right before we explode," Dante said. There was no way out of this death. Either the laser to the head or the exploding ship. At least either one would be quick, little more than a split moment of searing heat. I glanced at the last pod, the release button aflame, short-circuiting the connecting countdown button. I was so agonizingly close to escape. Then the flame burned hot to my cheeks and handed me a thought. I started this chain of explosions, and there is one last explosion I could cause. With limited oxygen, I strained to tell Dante, at least shoot me in the heart. A heart that was never yours. Filthy whore, he said, and shifted the laser from my temple to my chest. My chance. I snatched his hand, and with all my strength, managed to shift the laser up a few inches to my shoulder and pull the trigger. A burning hot searing flash tore through the top of my flesh, and I screamed out in pain, but mingled with my screams was an agonizing groan from Dante. I spun around to see the laser had skimmed the top of my shoulder, but struck right into his shoulder. It was not a deadly wound, but enough for me to escape. Dante's face screwed into hatred, and he tried to raise the laser, but his wounded shoulder slowed him. That bought me enough time to squeeze into the semi-opened pod, as he fired shots into the shield. Dante stood in the passage, clutching his shoulder and eyeing me. The pod won't release, he said. Like I'll never release you. The countdown button was blacked out. The pod wouldn't release, at least not by pressing the countdown or automatic release button. But there could be another way. I held up the rod, ready to cause the final explosion, praying it would work. I'll release myself, I said, and Dante's shocked eyes caught mine as he saw the rod in my hand. Despite thinning oxygen, I took the deepest, hardest breath possible, a breath that could be my very last, to try fill my lungs, because there would be no time to close the shield. Then, with careful underarm aim, I tossed the rod into the flames of the release button. Boom. The rod exploded with a tremor of a vicious earthquake, and it shot me and the pod out into the void of space like a shooting star. The remains of the ship and Dante erupted in an explosion of yellow and red-hot flame. The pod had shot clear of the ship, but the glass hatch remained open, and I held my breath while the pod was spinning end over end and out of control. I tried to press the button to close the shield, but the force and intense spinning flung me out of the pod. I reached forward and fingertip snatched the rim, holding on as I spun, the oxygen in my lungs slowly evaporating. My broken ribs burned as I tried to pull myself forward in an attempt to struggle back inside the pod, but the force swung me again and my fingers slipped from the rim. Alone. Floating in freezing cold space. The pod was swirling before me, fingertips from reach. My arms reaching, legs kicking. Space and stars whizzed around me, a dizzying array of lights. An image flashed into my mind, a vision of myself floating forever frozen in space. It wouldn't be so bad, I thought, better than a life with Dante and his thugs. And at least Tanton and Katie will live. And that did it. The image of those two on Cerulean made me fight harder. I must see them again. Despite the cold pressing me, my mind clicked into a higher state, and I stopped flailing my arms and kicking wildly, and instead straightened my body, until I was as stable and straight as the rod that blew me out here. My hands, fingers, every part of my body stretched forward, almost feeling like my spine was separating, making me a vital inch taller. The pod swung and swung and swung round close enough for me to get a solid grasp of the rim. I drew my hands to my chest and rocked forward into the pod, pain rampaging through my shoulder and broken ribs, body feeling a strange fizz from the vacuum of space. I shuffled myself upright and leaned back into the pod and reached to press the shield button, offering the silent prayer, please, oh please God, don't let it be broken, nor damaged from the explosion. The glass was intact and quickly closed over me. It brought a wave of relief and a fresh load of oxygen that spread into the pod with a gentle whoosh. The indicator showed the oxygen level rising, but I could not hold my breath until it fully returned. I opened my mouth and gasped and found the air hard to breathe, tight on my lungs. But the more I gasped, the more oxygen flowed into the pod, and with each breath came more oxygen until breathing eased. My body slumped down into the pod like a doll, lifeless, falling into a relaxed state I'd never experienced in my life. It was so relaxing, a state so calm, free of the violent mob-filled world that had dominated my life, that I could have stayed in that pod, resting, watching the unfathomable view of the cosmos until my breath ran out. But now I had something more to live for, two people to find. I typed Cerulean into the POD's search screen, and the thrusters ignited in a quiet gush and began moving me through space. The pod moved by the burning remains of the Welkin, and wove between pieces of shrapnel, and the men and women floating with their eyes and mouths opened, expressions forever of horror. It would be impossible to forget the sight, but as I traveled out through space, I did my best to concentrate not on death and not on searching for a source rod, but on survival on an unknown planet, where there would be a new search. A search for a little girl. And a search for Tanton,